with Jesmane. I don't know how many of you have gotten the book. It's a very, very insightful book, and I think at this time it resonates so much because Jesmane speaks about having gone through a journey of pain and reconciliation on a personal level, how that impacted her and a work through from a career perspective and all elements of her life. I think take us through just a bit of an excerpt on the sentiment of the book on the issues of pain and how it relates to identity and how that impacts how we perceive and view other people.
Historically mixed race, and in South Africa that dates back to the mid-1600s when we had racial mixing with the indigenous Khoisan and slaves brought in from Indonesia, Madagascar, India, Sri Lanka and other lands, and with European settlers. And that racial mixing was considered shameful and embarrassing, and it wasn't shared in our education system at school. And I always had this mystery to what is in my blood. And that is why the first chapter of my book is called I Am What, and it focuses on identity. And I did a DNA test to get a scientific answer on what I am, and I'm 38% European, 28% African, 7% East Asian, and a quarter Indian. So I feel I am my own melting pot, a bit of everything. And within my African DNA, which would apply to a lot of you, I have East African and West African blood. That's because I have a great-grandmother from St. Helena, and St. Helena included West African people. And some of us also forget that we had a Bantustan migration from other parts of Africa to Southern Africa. So I feel this connection to the world, including the different parts of Africa. And on the aspect of pain, it was a painful process to work through who I was, and also painful to reflect on the injustices of apartheid and how it affected me. And the words that came to mind was shame and pain. And in dealing with my lingering emotions, I realized that all South Africans need to be given that space to deal with their lingering emotions from apartheid. We had to get through university, and it was a new world. And when I started working in the mid-90s, it was a white-dominated work environment. So all of that just created pressure on figuring things out, and we never had time to process apartheid. And I do feel we need to acknowledge the pain and also the trauma from apartheid. When we see what happens play out on the media, we see anger, justifiable anger from students that fees, university fees are too expensive. We see anger with service delivery, protests by people who are unemployed, and the list goes on. But when we just look at the anger, we can think, why is that? Is the reaction disproportionate? But we need to look to the root cause, which is the pain and the trauma. And I feel that we need a second Truth and Reconciliation Commission in South Africa to bring people together, to be a wider place for discourse and a wider place for sustainable racial reconciliation. I also feel that corporates should set aside a portion of their budget for corporates and all institutions to give their staff trauma counseling from the impact of apartheid. And I think if we're not willing to go through the process of healing, we won't be able to move forward beyond being a violent and angry nation.
Well, thank you for sharing that. Cheryl, I'd like to come over to you. In light of what Jesmane just gave us a view of. You were raised in Trinidad and Tobago, you've lived in the UK, and you've also lived in South Africa for 10 years. So perhaps paint us a picture of how in other countries, how do people deal with identity issues? And countries like Trinidad would have suffered a lot of slavery. There's a lot of African slaves that have gone into their country. Have they been able to reconcile, make peace? And what does that look like? What is the global picture? What does it look like in the UK?
So, I was born in the UK and at age 3 moved to Trinidad and Tobago. My mother was Trinidadian of East Indian descent, so her great-grandparents would have come over to Trinidad as indentured labourers. And my father is Ghanaian, so West African, born and bred. At the age of 3, moving to Trinidad and Tobago, obviously you have sort of no recognition of race or identity as a child. But growing up and going through the school system there, you soon start to realize that Trinidad is definitely a melting pot of cultures. The makeup of the population is 40-something% East Indian, 50-something% African of the slave trade. And then you have remnants of the colonial masters. So you have English, Spanish, French. So there's a massive melting pot, probably not as diverse as South Africa or Jesmane herself, but quite diverse in comparison for a tiny island that is only a population of 1.6 million people. Now, what was very clear growing up as a child was there was a massive emphasis on unity. So you go to school, you sing your national anthem every day, you say your national pledge, and in that anthem there are lines like, "May every creed and race find an equal place, and may God bless our nation." It's drilled into you from childhood that we are not recognizing that you're Indian, you're black, you're white, you're Chinese, you're Lebanese, so there is actually that diversity there as well. So as a child, the world is pretty rosy and ideal in the Caribbean. Think about it, you've got the sea, the sand, and everybody's equal. Until you encounter adults with their, I want to say stupidity, but that's probably the wrong word. Their narrow views, and they impose this on you that, oh, your hair is nicer, or your skin tone is lighter, so you're prettier, or, oh, this, that, and the other. Now, imagine if we were to just sit in our little ideal and didn't have that interference from adults who've obviously got this trauma inbuilt in them, because we're talking about a colony. So although we had independence in circa 1950-something and Republic in 1965, so a lot earlier than South Africa came out of apartheid, I think you're comparing sort of apples with apples in a different time scale. So you've got a people who also have been through traumatic experiences. They've also been divided and conquered in certain ways. You've got Africans with a lot of chips on their shoulders because they think they're not as good or not as worthy as Indians. You've got Indians who were brought over as indentured labourers, were given a little bit more than the Africans, so they feel like they are better in some essence. And then you've got a lot of mixing between the races. So you've got a lot of children who are, like Jesmane, like myself, now growing up in this society. I'm hoping that the generation that is my generation and the generation below that, and below that, because there's a few generations below me now, I'm hoping that with those generations, the adults, like myself or in my peer group, I'm hoping that they actually sit back and not do things like not say to children, hey, you're this because of this, or you're better because of this. And I mean, we have all kinds of differences. On a human basic level, we can divide ourselves by eye color, by hair color, by whatever we want to. So I think it's not so dissimilar. Moving to the UK at age 13, when I spoke in my Trini accent and I came with my Trini sass, it wasn't acceptable. So I then had to learn to integrate in a very harsh way, because I'd come from, like I said, a background that everybody's equal and everybody's mixing and whatever, apart from whatever other little things you're hearing. And then you go into a society that you're starkly a minority. You know, I was literally the only black girl in my secondary school. And there was one other mixed race girl. She was half Jamaican, half white, half English, and two other black boys. So it was quite interesting to come to that. But the thing about the UK is, when it comes to race relation, and obviously I went through secondary school, A-levels, and then did university. University was a lot more mixed because people came from everywhere, which was quite nice. And I think that's where I came into my element, because that's when I could embrace all of my heritage. I can join the African Caribbean society, and I can have lots of Indian friends, and I can have lots of white friends as well. So university for me was really a beautiful experience in the UK. Then I went into the workforce, where I was again, because I'm a chartered surveyor, so that's property, it's very white male dominated. And here I am again, this black female in this industry. I would go to industry events and I'd feel like I'm back in school again. And the thing about the UK is we're very, when it comes to race, people try not to talk about it too much. You know, they would come and touch your hair. I remember when I started school, touch my hair and try and rub my skin to see if my color would come off. But actually, they never want to be called racist, so they're very polite about it. So the racism is very, very covert, and that's why in that society it appears less aggressive than, say, when things go down in our societies. But it's years and years and years of drilling into people, oh, you can't say that, you can't do that, that's not politically correct. You know, so the systems are there to deter you from appearing racist, but there are a lot of racism covertly there. Sorry, I'm just coming back to South Africa now. So comparing my experience in South Africa, what I like about South Africa is that you're very open about race. You talk about race very openly, which was quite shocking to me when I first came here 10 years ago.
I want to bring it to the side of the room and almost bring it home to South Africa. Jesmane has spoke about the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, what it achieved, what it didn't achieve. Maybe we need to do it again. We've gotten a bit of a global view in terms of how in South Africa our issues are not unique to us. And so I'd like to hear from the Nelson Mandela Foundation perspective, Ahmed Kathrada Foundation perspective. These two institutions are so grounded in the struggle and liberation of South Africa, right? There's so much heritage that it bolsters. And so I'd like to know, like, from your view, do you perceive that in all that has happened, have we really done enough to, after finding liberation, and have we done enough to create community and identity as a new South Africa? What's your take on that?
I think that, so for instance, coming from the TRC, there was this one incredible quote that said that the TRC was a theatre of pain. And there were many, many people who experienced the most horrendous things that came forward and just wanted answers. And they had to revisit that pain, they had to revisit that trauma. And And part of the issue has been that, so the TRC report now has been out, and the recommendations from the Commission have been laid. And those reparations haven't been paid. Many of them haven't been paid. And so, and on top of that, we still exist in a largely unequal society. And a lot of that inequality exists along racial lines. And part of that project in the TRC was the development of this narrative of the Rainbow Nation, this idea that there are many of us, we're all very diverse, and we're all together in a single band. And part of that metaphor was that the storm is over, that rainbows come off from huge rains, we've crossed this line. But over time we've seen that that's not true, that the storm is not over. That we're still in a crisis. A lot of that crisis has to do with economics and access to opportunities and the dignity of people. And I think the ask from this nation to itself has been to almost overlook that, to almost overlook the privatization of apartheid into gated communities, for instance, to overlook concentrations of wealth that were maintained and created during apartheid, through conquest and otherwise. And I think it's been a very difficult thing to do for many South Africans. And I think we struggle. And I think there are small pockets in particular along the middle class that in some ways has some sense of racial cohesion that is capable to call itself community across different races. But in many other ways, more so than that, most races don't interact. There was a study that was taken that said that most racial groups in South Africa have never had a conversation with one another. A conversation. And not like a whole extended dialogue, but it's a literal sit-down chat. And a part of that is to do with the spatial planning and the geography of a party that we live in, from Soweto to CBD, suburbs, and the rest of it, and Cape Town as well. And so with all of those considerations, I think that we haven't done as well as we could have or should have.
Have you experienced tribalism in any way, and what does that mean for you? Have you experienced that we are truly living in the time where we are united as part of this generation?
No, we are definitely not united. Like, I'm from, we spoke about tribalism. I'm Tswana by culture, and then we engage in such a way that we are so divided by language, by geographical areas. Like the formation of the Bantustan kind of placed us in such a divide, and we continue to live in such a South Africa. And when I came to university, that's when I started engaging with people of different races, of people of different ethnicities. And when we start engaging, you realize how very different we are, and how we don't understand each other. So as South Africans who are a rainbow nation, we are a very spread rainbow. Like, we are too spread. When I came here, I realized that such things as racism, like when we were taught in high school and school, we're like, oh, we live in a rainbow nation, we are diverse people who are united. No, that's not my lived experience. But then that's what we want to live in. That's the South Africa we want to live in. In my lived experience, I still don't know what Itumeleng means. I don't know what that section of the national anthem means. We may have sold us out, I don't know. But then that is our lived experiences. We are not that united. Like in my lived experience, the tribalism, the racism is not that covert. Like it's centered around borders of class, where you see that when you live in Kasi, like the people are we're Kasi people. That's the most united place that I've ever seen. Where people, where black people see each other as black people, where you learn other people's languages and it doesn't matter. But then when you get to certain spaces, you find people who are like, what is this unity? What language do you speak? Setswana, what's that? Where are they? Oh, we are other. We other each other through languages, through the color of your skin. Just because you're light skinned, you're better. Just because the texture of your skin, of your hair is like silkier, you're better. We love being better. We have not been we have not reached that stage where we're united and we see each other as one. This rainbow is too scattered to be a rainbow. I really don't even think that it's a rainbow anymore, the way we're too scattered.
Let's just start shining a light a little bit on Africa, African countries, and how they've really helped South Africa and the things we don't really talk about.
I think the first point I want to make is that if you read Mandela's writings and his speeches, nowhere did he say that 1994 was freedom. But it was very clear that 1994 was the opportunity for South Africans to define their freedom. He never said that we are now free, everything we have arrived. And what he was simply saying is that we now have the opportunity to define this freedom. He never used he didn't coin the notion of a revolution. There's something that Archbishop Tutu did and others basically to go ahead. So we were very clear at that point in time that the idea of a united South Africa was something that needed to be worked towards. How long it was going to take, nobody was going to be able to say. We were also very clear that dealing with the legacy of apartheid was going to take decades and was not going to be dealt with within 2 or 3 decades. Nowhere would we have been able to have even contemplated solving the problems of this country within 50 years or 100 years. It was an impossibility, and therefore I think that simplifying those kinds of things to say that the idea of a united, a non-racial country signifies anything other than something that we still needed to aspire to is wrong. I think secondly, the Truth and Reconciliation process was precisely that, was meant to have been a process. The problem with us is that we stopped at the end of the TRC process itself. Reconciliation work was then never ever pursued with a clear agenda and with vigor and with energy and commitment and honesty. You will not find a reconciliation roadmap or process after the TRC movement. So to quote the TRC process and to blame it for all the ills that might have come thereafter, I think is also slightly incorrect. That was also the process. But I think if you speak to many of the victims, as I have done, who went before those hearings and actually had the opportunity for the first time to go and speak about their own trauma, or to speak about people whom they have lost in the process, you will not get the same kind of, you won't get the same sentiment that was a complete whitewash and waste of time. So I think we must also be mindful about time and place and historical context when we begin to articulate those things and pronounce on them as if the context of today is the same as the context of the time. I think in terms of Africa, we made one big mistake in my view, is we always think the continent itself is without its own divisions. And as if North and South and East and West Africa are all the same. It's not. And in the same way, support for the liberation struggle was not uniform. There were many African countries who collaborated with the apartheid government, who supported its Bantustan programs, who by 1989 had kicked out liberation movements from their countries and were almost prepared to start the negotiations process without the involvement of South Africans. Had the Berlin Wall not fallen, and if the Klerk had not unbanned the ANC at that time, there is a lot of evidence that the ANC itself might have been kicked out of Zambia, would have had to have moved out of Lusaka. It was already out of Angola, it was already out of Mozambique, couldn't operate from Botswana, couldn't operate from Swaziland. Its presence in Zimbabwe itself was very limited, but they were now being forced out. There were a number of African countries who were colluding with the West, but even the Soviet Union itself was putting pressure on the South Africans to come to a negotiated settlement. So now the whole entire continent was behind this liberation struggle, as we tried to do. And I think that the issue of that false narrative is that it leads us also to, when we talk about xenophobia in this country, we then tend to argue that because people were given exile or homes there, therefore we should not be xenophobic. For me, that shouldn't even be an argument. It's the fact that xenophobia is wrong, irrespective of whether they gave the ANC or liberation movements exile and so forth. But because our understanding, we want to see Africa as just one entity, we want to then romanticize its contribution, but we also then want to use false arguments about why xenophobia is wrong, rather than just calling it for what it is and dealing with the facts of the matter. The devastation by apartheid on the southern African countries was immense. The Angolan economy, I think Angola, Zimbabwe, Zambia to a certain extent, were devastated by the South African Defence Force. Angola today has never recovered from the havoc that the South African Defence Force wreaked on that country. Mozambique, the wars between Renamo and Frelimo was fostered and driven and funded by the South African Defence Force. The bombings in Botswana by the South African Defence Force made those countries dirty. When Swaziland thought it could do its own thing, they were basically ring-fenced and were almost starved out of it, and had to then capitulate and then ask all of the people to move. So the Southern African countries in the first instance bore the brunt of their opposition to apartheid. You have heard of examples of the contributions by ordinary Nigerians to the anti-apartheid fund. The kind of local rands and cents and dollars and money came to billions that ordinary residents put forward. But it was not the entire continent. There were a number of countries who supported visibly, others where citizens took the lead, and others who actually collaborated. I think our growth as a country, in conclusion, this country will not grow economically unless it is firmly integrated into the economy of the continent and until it begins to see itself as a fully fledged member of the African continent. If it tends to think of itself otherwise, it will never succeed.
Very, very, very insightful. I'd like to show something on Jesmane's book, page 127. You guys have been watching, please get the book. It's very, very free. You say, on speaking about reframing for individuals and groups, you say there is no doubt that we constantly write and rewrite, interpret and reinterpret the stories of our lives. and that what is written in the past and present chapters has a large influence over what will be written in future pages. As far as I'm concerned, the only issue is whether or not we choose to consciously guide the process to decide who will be the author or interpreter of our story, and in so doing, to open ourselves up to all the possibilities that are within our reach. Now, with that said, I'd like to just get some closing sentiments for the first part of the panel. What are your closing thoughts on how we are going to reframe and retell our story moving forward? What will foster some social cohesion despite all the things that divide us? What is going to unite us as South Africans, as Africans, and as global citizens? Just like everyone just has brief closing thoughts on that.
Reframing is used by psychologists when they have in therapy for people who've gone through trauma. So it's a very important step to move on from trauma, because one is taken back to the resentment, the anger, the fear, the shame, the pain, the various emotions that were elicited from the traumatic incident. And reframing is very powerful to move forward. And for me, when I visited the slave lodge where my ancestors were kept in the Cape, I was so stuck in the cruelty and the horrendous conditions that my ancestors faced. And it took me a long time to become unstuck. And I think a lot of people and societies and nations are stuck in events in the past and they can't move forward. And I had to think about what are positive segments for me, and I thought, rather than seeing my slave ancestors as victims, see them as resilient, that they put their stamp on South African culture, that they survived slavery, that they are role models from the community who have overcome that, and that some slave nations, India, Indonesia, are G20 countries with such a legacy of culture and history, and I'm part of that culture and history. And for us as South Africans, I think to reframe the story of apartheid, we recognize that it was a terrible, inhumane system, but to recognize that we have overcome, that we can move forward together as a nation, and maybe to Refiloe's point that and Neeshan's point that the Rainbow Nation might be idealistic, but for us to think about how can we overcame apartheid as a collective. It was whites and blacks coming together, and how do we keep on overcoming in that spirit of unity. We have a long way to go, but to recognize we have made progress, and we can continue to build on that progress and make more progress and become a unified nation.
I think that moving forward, we need to first of all acknowledge our differences. You have to, when one speaks of their identity, you're speaking of the recognition of self, the knowing of self. So you should recognize that none of us are perfect, are a perfect set of genes of blackness, of Tswananess, of Zuluness, of we are all a mixture of something, and we are all made by our interactions with one another. So in order to basically come together, we need to realize that each and every one of us is a product of our interactions together. And from there, I think that is when we will be able to move forward and realize that we are not, your struggles are not unique. As soon as we start speaking to each other about these types of issues, you'll realize that our struggles are not unique. and someone has come up with the solution. It's just that you don't know about it because you have not engaged. So I feel like, yeah, we need to discover ourselves and start talking to each other.
Just building on reframing and acknowledging differences, I think one of the key aspects as well is just recognizing humanity and our humanity and acknowledging the differences but focusing on similarities, because that is where our humanity, we can't lose that. You know, I think the traumatic experiences that's embedded in the nation and in your DNA and in our DNA globally will play out itself in a way that we become so numb to things happening that are bad, or you know, I think we definitely need to try and focus on being positive and reinforcing that positivity with our children and our children's children, because if we lose that humanity, we are in for a long struggle. So yeah, just really focusing on the similarities, acknowledging the differences, but focusing on the similarities and recognizing the humanity and trying to move forward from that as well. There's so much around this though, because we talked about economy and economics, and there's so much disparity and so much we need to do, but starting from the base, I mean, going back to what I said about in school, what was a real focus was unity, and maybe impressing on our government that we need to do things like refocus on that rainbow nation and put out those messages and make sure that it's drilled into our children and our children's children and even ourselves as adults, like take it upon ourselves individually to do that.
So Nazi Germany was a very cohesive country. It was cohesive against Jews. South Africa is a very cohesive country against foreigners. If there's one thing, if you look at all research in this country, South Africans across age, race, geography, they are xenophobic. So the kind of social cohesion the country needs is cohesion around a set of values and a set of aspirations, not just general social cohesion. So in that context, we need social cohesion that will unite across race, class, religion, tribe, ethnicity, and so forth. But cohesion that will tackle the inequality, will tackle racial divisions, will tackle the othering of society. But it's also cohesion that will only come about when there is leadership that will aim to unite people around the issues that are possible to unite. And I think we've seen flashes of that. We've seen the whole outpouring of activism and mobilization on the issue of gender and the issue of climate change in the last 2 weeks. And because you had leadership there that focused on the issues and were inclusive and really said everybody come on board, you were able to see South Africans of all kinds of shapes and colors out onto the streets around those issues. So leadership for social cohesion, in my view, is the one biggest missing element in all of this. It's easy to divide people and rally people around a narrow kind of chauvinistic agenda. It's easy to rally people around anger, less so around the more positive things. But the opportunities are there. The climate crisis for me is the biggest issue around which we can bring people together, because it's really the survival of everybody else. It's not your race or your color or gender that's going to stop you from dying when the calamity hits. Social standing might be delayed for a couple of years and so forth in location. But if you don't have a leadership that is able to bring people together to determine that kind of common agenda, then I don't think it will succeed. But it must be social cohesion based on a set of values and aspirations. Otherwise, just general social cohesion won't take it anywhere.
I think I would agree, and I think that the kind of leadership that we need is one that inspires as opposed to a kind of strongman leadership. And I think Africa is filled with strongman leaders. And when you have strongman leadership, you see very weak institutions, and so democracy gets broken down in those ways. But also, I don't think strongman leadership is necessarily an autocrat. I think that we also see strongman leaders when people have such high hopes concentrated around one person, one leader, where they outsource their agency to that leader, that Ramaphosa will fix it, that Mbeki will fix it, that Mandela will fix it, that Mandela will fix it. Then people put their tools down and they won't do the work. I recently read this article about people-pleasing, and how people-pleasing is a symptom of trauma, and how there's a deeply embedded fear of conflict or disgruntlement. You know what I mean? So you'll do everything in your power to make that person happy because you're so terrified of having to relive the trauma of conflict again. And I think that our country is experiencing some of that, this inability to look those ghosts in the face. And I think we're deeply ghosted as a nation. I think we live amongst ghosts. I think our universities are ghosts. I think the hippos, the police hippos, are ghosts. I think tear gas is a ghost. I think the street names, the flag, the statues, our geography haunts us all, and we're incensed by our trauma to not fix them, to not startle that situation, to not talk about it. But I also think that capitalism is deeply involved in our trauma. There's no dignity in poverty. You can't see yourself engaging in any kind of real conversation or cohesion with other people when you live through the indignity of trauma. So coming back to that first point about leadership, I think we need leadership. Perhaps as an organization, individuals, but also just as a movement of ideas that is imaginative, that is creative, and that is experimental, that will acknowledge the ghosts, that will let them speak. And the most difficult part is to also then, in a sense, hope that the trauma will end, that we are capable of healing.